Hi, 5th graders. Welcome to Lesson 5.7, Write Zeros in the Dividend. The essential question for this lesson is, when do you write a zero in the dividend to find a quotient? Now, go ahead and open up your Go Math workbooks to Lesson 5.7, found on page 113, and let's get started. Now, let's take a look at question number 2. For question 2, our job is to divide these two numbers, and what we have is 405 being divided by 25. Now, I'm going to go ahead and begin the division process because I have two whole numbers that I'm dividing with. So what I'm going to do first is this. I'm going to look in the hundredths place. Well, what I know is I can't divide that 4 in the hundredths place by 25. So now I'm going to move over to the tens place. So now I have a 40 being divided by 25. And what I know is this. I know that 25 goes into 40 one time. So I'm going to go ahead and write a 1 above the tens place here, right above the 0. Now, that takes care of my division. My next step says to multiply. So I'm going to multiply my 1 times my 25, and 1 times 25 is going to give me 25. So I'm going to write my 25 down. Now my next step says to subtract. So I'm now going to subtract 25 from 40. Well, I can't take 5 away from the 0, so I'm going to go ahead and regroup, and that 4 is going to become a 3, and that 0 is going to become a 10. I know that 10 minus 5 is going to give me 5. And 3 minus 2 is going to be a 1. Now my next step says to check. I know that 15 is less than 25, so we're on the right track so far. Now my next step says to bring down. So I'm going to go ahead and bring down my 5. And so what I now have is 155 being divided by 25. Well, I'm going to do a little guess and check here. I'm going to look first of all at my 2 and my 15. And what I know is 2 goes into 15 about 7 times. So I'm going to do my first guess and check down here. I'm going to take my 25 and I'm going to multiply it first of all by 7. Because once again, I know that 2 times 7 comes close to being a 15. It gives me 14, which is really close to 15. So I'm going to go ahead and take 25 and multiply it by 7. Well, 7 times 5 is going to give me 35, and I'm going to regroup the 3. 7 times 2 is 14, plus 3 is going to give me 17. Well, what I know is 175 is too high. So I'm going to have to do another guess and check. So I'm now going to take my 25 and I'm going to now multiply it by 6. Well, I know that 6 times 5 is going to give me 30, and I'm going to regroup the 3. 6 times 2 is 12, plus 3 is going to give me 15. So what I know is 25 goes into 155 6 times. So I'm going to go ahead and write my 6 right up here up top above the 5 in the ones place. Now I'm going to go ahead and multiply. 6 times 25 gives me 150. And now my next step is to subtract. Well, 5 minus 0 is going to leave me with 5. Now let's do our next step, which is check. I know that 5 is less than 25, so we're still on the right track. But the problem is, I don't have any more numbers left to bring down. Now, when I don't have any numbers left to bring down, here's what has to happen. I'm now going to insert a decimal point. So here's my decimal point. And then I'm going to be able to add zeros to finish out my division. So once again, when I've divided and I have no more numbers left to bring down, I'm going to insert a decimal point, and I'm going to begin to add zeros until I can complete my division. Now, my next step needs to be this. Now that there's a decimal point in my problem, I have to make sure that I bring that decimal point up top also in the quotient. So I'm going to go ahead and write that decimal point right up top, right here behind the 16, because once again I want to make sure my decimal points line up. So the decimal point from here is now up in the quotient as well. Now the next thing I'm going to do is this. I'm going to go ahead and drop that 0 down. We're going to bring the 0 down. Now I'm looking at a 50 being divided by 25. What I know is this. 25 goes into 50 2 times. So I'm going to go ahead and now write a 2 above my 0 that I put in place. And I know that 2 times 25 is going to give me 50. So I'm going to write down a 50, and then I'm going to subtract, and I'm now left with a remainder of 0. Once I have that remainder of 0, and there's no more numbers left to bring down, I know that I'm done with my division. So what I know is 405 divided by 25 gives me a quotient of 16 and 2/10. So once again, when you run out of numbers, when there aren't enough digits to complete the division, you need to make sure that you insert a decimal point and then add a 0. Now, let's take a look at question number 4. For question number 4, we have the whole number 30 being divided by the decimal 8/10. Now remember, our divisor cannot be a decimal number. So I have to first of all turn that decimal number, my divisor, into a whole number. Now I can very easily do that by moving that decimal point over to the right one time. So I'm going to take that decimal and I'm going to move it over to the right one time. And so now what happens is 8/10 has now become the whole number 8. And all that I've done is I've multiplied it by a 10. Now, I also have to make sure that whatever I do to my divisor, I have to multiply by the same power of 10 with my dividend as well. So what that means is I first of all need to add a decimal behind my 30, and then I'm going to move that over one time to the right as well. Now the problem is there's an empty space. Well, we know that when we have our empty spaces, it's okay to go ahead and add a 0. So that 30 now becomes a 300 because just like with our divisor, we also had to multiply the dividend by 10. So my new problem now becomes this, and I'm going to go ahead out here and I'm going to rewrite it. We now have 300 being divided by the whole number 8. Now I'm going to go ahead and begin to work the division here. So what I'm going to look at first is this. I'm going to start with that 3 in the hundreds place. Well, I can't divide a 3 by an 8. So I'm going to have to move over then to the tens place, and now I have this 30 being divided by 8. And just knowing my basic facts, I know that 8 goes into 30 a total of 3 times. So I'm going to write a 3 up top, and what I know is 3 times 8 is going to give me 24. So I'm going to go ahead and write my 24 down, and I know that my next step says to subtract. Well, I can't take my 4 away from 0, so I'm going to have to regroup. So that 3 becomes a 2, and that 0 becomes a 10. Well, I know that 10 minus 4 is going to give me 6, so I'm going to go ahead and write the 6 down. Now, let's check. Is 6 less than 8? And it is, so we know that we're still on the right track. Now, my next step says to bring down. So I'm going to go ahead and bring down my 0 next to my 6. So now I have a 60 being divided by 8. Well, once again, knowing my basic facts, I know that 8 goes into 60 7 times. So I'm going to write a 7 above the 0. Now I'm going to go ahead and multiply my 7 times my 8, and 7 times 8 is going to give me 56. So I'm going to go ahead and write my 56 down, and then I have to subtract. Well, I can't take 6 away from 0, so we're going to go ahead and regroup again. That 6 becomes a 5, and that 0 becomes a 10. And I know that 10 minus 6 is going to leave me with 4. Well, once again, I know that when I check, 4 is less than 8, so we're on the right track. But the problem is, we've now run out of digits and we can't complete the division. So what we're going to have to do is this. Once again, we're going to have to insert a decimal. So we're going to insert the decimal here. Now remember, when you insert the decimal in the dividend, you also have to make sure that you bring the decimal point up into the quotient. So we're going to go ahead and now we're going to bring that decimal point right up here behind my 37. And we need to once again make sure that our decimal points stay lined up from the dividend to the quotient. Now, once we've added that decimal point to the quotient, our next step is this. We can go ahead and add zeros so that we can now complete the division. Now, what I'm going to do next is this. Now that we've inserted our decimal and added our 0, I'm going to go ahead and bring that 0 down. So we're going to drop the 0 down next to the 4. Well, now I'm looking at a 40 being divided by 8. And what I know is 8 goes into 40 5 times. So I'm now going to go ahead and write that 5 here above the 0. And I know that 5 times 8 is going to give me 40. So I'm going to write my 40 down over here, and then I'm going to subtract. Well, I know that 40 minus 40 is going to leave me with a remainder of 0. Now, once again, when I've divided all of my numbers and I have no numbers left to bring down, and my remainder is a 0, I know that my division is complete. So what I know is 30 divided by 8/10 gives me a quotient of 37 5/10. Now let's take a look at question number 6. For question 6, we have 97 3/10 being divided by the whole number 35. Well, what's nice about this problem is my divisor is already a whole number, so I don't have to move a decimal out front or multiply it by a power of 10. But what I do notice is this. My dividend is a decimal number. So as my first step in this division, what I want to do is I want to take my decimal that's in the dividend and I want to move it right up top and place it in the quotient. So I'm going to go ahead and write my decimal right up top, So I'm going to take it and I'm going to write it here. And once again, we're going to make sure that our decimal point from the dividend to the quotient lines up. Once I have my decimal point in place, I'm now ready to go ahead and begin my division. So I'm going to go ahead and look. I have a 9 in the tens place, and I'm trying to divide that 9 by 35. Well, I know that I can't divide 9 by 35, so I'm now going to move over to the ones place. So now I have 97 ones being divided by 35. So what I need to do is I need to figure out how many times can 35 go into or fit into 97. So I'm going to do a little guess and check. I know first of all that 3 would go into 9 about 3 times. So I'm going to come down to the bottom and I'm going to take my 35 and I'm going to first of all multiply it by 3. That's going to be my first guess and check. Well, I know that 3 times 5 is going to give me 15. I'm going to regroup the 1. 3 times 3 is 9, plus 1 more is going to give me 10. Well, what I notice is 105 is too big. It's larger than my 97. So I'm going to have to do another guess and check. I'm now going to take my 35 and I'm going to multiply it by 2. Well, I know that 2 times 5 is going to give me 10, so I'm going to regroup the 1. 2 times 3 is 6, plus the regrouped 1 is going to give me a 7. So I know that 97 divided by 35 is going to be 2. So I'm going to go ahead and write a 2 right up top here above the 7. That takes care of the division step. Now I'm going to multiply 2 times 35, and I know that 2 times 35 is going to give me 70. So I'm going to go ahead and write my 70 down, and now I'm going to go ahead and subtract. Well, I know that 7 minus 0 is going to give me 7, and 9 minus 7 is going to give me a 2. Now, let's check. Is 27 less than 35? And it is, so we know that we're on the right track. Now, my next step says to bring down. So I'm going to go ahead and bring my 3 down here next to my 7. So now we have 273 being divided by 35. Well, what I know is, and I'm going to look at this 3, and I'm going to look at my 27, and I know that 3 goes into 27 about 9 times, so I'm going to try my 9 first. I'm going to take that 35, and I'm going to multiply it. I'm going to do my guess and check over here. I'm going to multiply it by 9. Well, I know that 9 times 5 is going to give me 45, so I'm going to write my 5 down and regroup the 4. 9 times 3 is 27, plus 4 would be 31. Well, I know that that's too high, so I'm going to have to do another guess and check. I'm now going to take my 35 and I'm going to multiply it by 8. Well, 8 times 5 is going to give me 40. Regroup the 4. 8 times 3 is 24, plus 4 would give me 28. Well, I'm now at a 280, but that's still too high because my number is 273. So I'm going to do another guess and check. I'm going to take that 35 and I'm going to multiply it by 7. 7 times 5 is going to give me 35. And 7 times 3 is going to give me 21, plus 3 would give me 24. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put my 7 up top here, because what I know is when I divide 273 by 35, it fits in there about 7 times. So I'm going to write my 7 up top. Now when I multiply, 7 times 35 is going to give me 245. So I'm going to write down my 245, and then I'm going to have to subtract. Well, I can't take 5 away from 3, so I'm going to have to regroup. So that 7 becomes a 6, and that 3 becomes a 13. Well, I know that 13 minus 5 is going to give me 8, and 6 minus 4 is going to give me a 2. Now, let's check. Is 28 less than 35? And it is, so we know that we're on the right track. But the problem is we've now run out of digits. I don't have any more numbers left to bring down, but I still have division left to complete. So what I'm going to have to do is this. I'm now going to have to add a 0. So I'm going to go ahead and add a 0 here behind my 3. Now remember, I don't have to insert a decimal because we already have a decimal point in place and it's already up in the quotient. So if you have a decimal point in place, you can go ahead and add zeros to complete your division. Now my next step is going to be this. I'm going to go ahead and bring down that 0 next to my 28. So what I'm looking at now is 280 being divided by 35. Well, I know that in my earlier guess and check, when I multiply 35 times 8, I get an answer of 280. So I'm going to go ahead and write that 8 up top above the 0. Now once again, when I multiply 8 times 35, I know that it gives me 280. So I'm going to write my 280 down and then subtract, and I'm left with a remainder of 0. Now, once my remainder is 0, and I have no more digits left to bring down, I know that my division is complete. So what that tells me is 97 3/10 divided by 35 gives me a quotient of 2 and 78/100. Now, let's take a look at question number 13. It's one of our real-world problem-solving questions, and number 13 says, Mark has a board that is 12 feet long. He cuts the board into 8 pieces that are the same length. How long is each piece? So what we know is this. Mark has a board that is 12 feet long, and he wants to cut the board into 8 pieces that are each the same length. So my problem becomes 12 divided by 8. Now, I'm going to go ahead and begin working that division, and what I know is this. First of all, 8 cannot go into the 1 in the tens place. So I'm going to move over to the ones place, so now we're looking at 8 going into 12 ones. I know that 8 goes into 12 one time, so I'm going to go ahead and write a 1 above the 2. Now, 1 times 8 is going to give me 8, so I'm going to go ahead and write my 8 down, and then my next step says to subtract. Well, I know that 12 minus 8 is going to leave me with 4. Now, the problem is we've run out of digits and we still have division left to complete. Well, what I know is this. I know that if I run out of digits, I don't have enough digits to complete the division, it's okay to insert a decimal and also add a 0. Now, the key is this. When you insert a decimal in the dividend, you must also insert a decimal into the quotient right above it. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to place my decimal in the quotient as well. So I'm going to bring that decimal right up top. So my decimal is now in place. Now my next step is going to be this. I'm going to go ahead and bring down the 0 next to the 4. So now I'm looking at a 40 being divided by 8. Well, knowing my basic facts, I know that 8 goes into 40 5 times. So I'm going to write my 5 down above the 0, and I know that 5 times 8 is going to give me 40. So I'm going to go ahead and write my 40 down here and subtract, and I know that 40 minus 40 is going to leave me with 0. Well, once my remainder is 0 and I have no numbers left to bring down, my division is complete. So what that tells me is each piece of wood, each piece of board that he's cutting is going to be 1 5/10 feet long. Now, let's take a look at question number 14. It's another one of our real-world problem-solving questions, and it says, Josh pays $7.59 for 2 2/10 pounds of ground turkey. What is the price per pound of the ground turkey? So once again, what we know is this. We know that Josh pays $7.59 for 2 2/10 pounds of ground turkey. Now, if we want to find the price per pound, what we have to do is we're going to take our $7.59 and we're going to have to divide that by our 2 2/10 pounds of ground turkey. Now, before I can begin my division, here's what I notice. I notice that my divisor is a decimal. Well, I have to make sure that my divisor is a whole number before I can begin dividing. So what I need to do is this. I'm going to take that decimal and I'm going to move it over 1 time to the right to make that 2 2/10 into the whole number 22. Now remember, if I make that move with the divisor, if I make that or move that decimal over 1 time to the right, I also have to do the same thing to my dividend as well. So I'm now going to take the decimal that's behind the 7, and I'm going to also move it over 1 time to the right, and I'm going to now place it in between the 5 and the 9. Now I'm going to come over here and I'm going to rewrite my problem because what I now have is this. I now have 75 9/10 being divided by the whole number 22. Because once again, we had to make sure that our divisor was a whole number first, so we moved the decimal over 1 time to the right, making 2 2/10 into the whole number 22. And I did the same thing for the dividend. I took my decimal, moved it over 1 time to the right, so 7 59/100 now becomes 75 9/10. Now we're ready to go ahead and begin our division. My first step needs to be this. I have a decimal in the dividend, so I need to make sure that I take that decimal and place it up top in my quotient so that I'm ready to actually begin dividing my numbers. So I'm going to go ahead and place that decimal right up top in the quotient, and now we can go ahead and begin the division. Well, I know that I cannot divide the 7 in the tens place by the 22, so I'm going to move over to that 5 in the ones place. So now we have 75 ones being divided by 22. Well, I'm going to have to do a little guess and check. I'm going to think about a 2 going into a 7, and what I know is 2 goes into 7 about 3 times. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to take my 22 and I'm going to come down here and I'm going to multiply that 22 times 3. Well, I know that 3 times 2 is 6, and 3 times 2 is also going to give me a 6. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say that when I divide 75 by 22, 22 goes into 75 a total of 3 times. So I'm going to write that 3 up here above the 5. Now I know that 3 times 22 is going to give me 66, so I'm going to write my 66 down. I'm going to go ahead and subtract. Well, I can't take the 6 away from the 5, so I'm going to regroup. 7 becomes a 6, and that 5 becomes a 15. Well, I know that 15 minus 6 is going to give me 9, so I'm going to write my 9 down. Now let's check. Is 9 less than 22? And it is, so we know we're on the right track. Now my next step says to bring down. So I'm going to bring that 9 down next to the 9. So now we're dividing 99 by 22. Well, let's do another guess and check here. I know that a 2 would fit into a 9 about 4 times, so I'm going to come down to the bottom and I'm going to take my 22 and I'm going to multiply it by 4. Well, I know that 4 times 2 is 8, and 4 times another 2 is also 8. So what I know is 22 fits into 99 about 4 times. So I'm going to go ahead and write that 4 up top right above my 9 in the tens place. And now I'm going to multiply. 4 times 22 is going to give me 88. So I'm going to write my 88 down, and then I'm going to subtract. Well, 9 minus 8 is 1, and 9 minus 8 is also 1, so I'm left now with 11. Well, I know that 11 is less than 22, so we're on the right track, but the problem is we don't have any digits left to complete our division. So what we talked about is this. We know that if we don't have enough digits left to complete the division, it's okay to insert a decimal and add a 0. Well, in this problem, a decimal is already in place. It's in place in the dividend and also in the quotient. So what I need to do is I need to go ahead and add a 0 to complete my division. So I'm going to put the 0 in place, and now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to bring that 0 down. So now that 0 comes down next to my 11, and now I'm looking at 110 being divided by 22. Well, I'm going to do another guess and check. I know that 2 would fit into 11 about 5 times, so I'm going to take my 22 and I'm going to multiply that 22 times 5 and see where that takes me. So here's my 22 times 5. I know that 5 times 2 is 10. 5 times 2 is 10 again, plus the regrouped 1 is 11. So what I know is 110 divided by 22 is going to be 5. So I'm going to go ahead and write down a 5 above that 0. And then when I work my multiplication, 5 times 22 is 110. So I'm going to go ahead and write my 110 down and then subtract. When I do that, I'm left with a remainder of 0. Well, once my remainder is 0 and I have no numbers left to bring down, I know that my division is complete. So what that tells me is the price per pound of the ground turkey is going to be $3.45. Now, your homework for tonight will be to complete question number 1 and question number 2, as well as numbers 3 through 6 found in your Go Math workbook on page 114. Don't forget, somewhere on your homework page, let us know if you're number 1 a novice, number 2 an apprentice, number 3 a practitioner, or number 4 an expert. Don't forget, your homework for tonight will be to complete question number 1 and question number 2, as well as numbers 3 through 6 found in your Go Math workbook on page 114. We hope you have a great evening, and we look forward to seeing you in class tomorrow.